This is the usual M-Cube seminar spot, and today it's a joint seminar with ACOM. Today our speaker is Mary Barth. Mary Barth's a senior scientist at NCAR's ACOM and M-Cubed, where she's also deputy head of the weather modeling and research section. Mary's the lead scientist of the NCAR cross-cutting project system for integrated modeling of the atmosphere, or SEMA. She also leads the multi-scale infrastructure for chemistry and aerosols, musica. That means music in Italian, maybe also in Spanish, I don't know. Yeah, I see, okay. Yeah, okay, great. Well, that's a great acronym. Anyway, you may agree that I think Mary's probably the most interdisciplinary of scientists that we have here at NCAR. If there was a competition, she'd have my vote. She's been very active in international cooperative programs. She served for 8 years on the International Commission on Clouds and Precipitation, 5 years on the International Global Atmospheric Chemistry Scientific Steering Committee, 3 years on the Advisory Committee for NSF Geosciences Directorate, and she's currently president of the International Commission on Atmospheric Chemistry and Global Pollution. Mary's a member of the AGU and a fellow of the AMS. Mary's research focuses on interactions between clouds and chemistry, in particular, cloud effects on trace gases and aerosols, including scavenging by precipitation, lightning, production of NOx, and aqueous chemistry, aerosol interactions with deep convection, and effects of thunderstorms on the composition of the upper atmosphere. And I think this seminar will probably combine all of this. Vertical transport of trace gases and aerosols and deep convection, analysis of observations from seekers and DC-3 field campaigns. Mary?
So is this working okay? Good. All right. No? Yes? Good. Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. As Rich said, I'm going to talk about vertical transport of trace gases and aerosols and deep convection. This is primarily analyzing observations from the DC-3 and seekers field campaigns. And so to that end, I have like hundreds of people to thank, particularly to the DC-3 and seekers science team members who gathered these really great measurements. But special thanks to these people in blue who have helped out with the analysis over the years. This is a little bit of culmination of work for the last 10 years. A lot of people have been involved. I'm going to start by talking about how deep convection affects the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. So here's a schematic that I stole from the NCAR ACOM UTLS section that shows the transport pathways between the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. And we know in the upper troposphere that ozone is a key constituent because it's a greenhouse gas. And what we see with convection is that the convective outflow regions contain HOX precursors and NOx precursors that make ozone downwind. And that can be actually quite a bit, especially right after that storm, up 15 parts per billion per day. That's a significant increase. So just to speed you up on some chemistry and throw as many chemical names out there as I can to this M-Cube audience, I want to just remind you how to make ozone. You actually use one ozone and break it, photolize it down to make two OHs. And then you need these volatile organic compounds, and you need nitric oxide to create NO2 that then photolizes to make ozone. So when you get your car emissions done, right, you get measured for CO, volatile organic compounds, and nitric oxides. So these are things that are impacting ozone. Along the way, we have some little outlet spots to go to, and I want to highlight 3 trace gases: formaldehyde, hydrogen peroxide, and methyl hydrogen peroxide. And these 3 trace gases are sort of like short-term reservoir species that contribute to ozone formation. Besides the trace gases, convective outflows are regions where new particle formation occurs. I knew that would happen, right? Sorry. And so this has been measured many times by aircraft in a number of studies where we see this high rate of new particle formation. And we know that our aerosols are a key player in the radiation balance of the atmosphere, and in cloud formation. So 2 important reasons to try to understand how deep convection's affecting the upper tropospheric composition. So my question is, what fractions of ozone precursors and aerosol mass reach the upper troposphere? These key ozone precursors I'm going to talk about are, again, formaldehyde, hydrogen peroxide, and methyl hydrogen peroxide. I'm going to ask whether these fractions differ between weak convection and severe convection, between marine convection and continental convection. So here's my outline for today. I'm going to start by giving a little more background on what happens to a trace gas or aerosol as it's vertically transported from near the surface to the upper troposphere. Then I'll talk about how we approached analyzing the observations to get our scavenging efficiencies. And then we'll talk about results, comparing weak convection, severe convection, marine convection. Talk a little bit about the role of ice physics on the transport of soluble trace gases, and then finish with a discussion about aerosol scavenging. Okay, so another great schematic. I stole this one from NOAA that I then annotated with what are the key processes going on when we move air from that gets ingested into deep convection. And by far, transport from the PBL to the upper troposphere is the most important process. But I'm going to advocate that we need to also understand the scavenging of soluble trace gases and aerosols. These other processes, especially lightning production of NOx, is crucial as well, especially to ozone production. Looking at that scavenging, I'm going to focus on these 3 constituents and tell you a little bit about what they're going to have happen to them. Right? These are all soluble trace gases. Hydrogen peroxide is very soluble, formaldehyde is moderately soluble, and methyl hydrogen peroxide is mildly soluble. So you would expect different behaviors for those 3. The other thing I want to point out is that the colder it is, the more soluble the species is. And so as an air parcel moves from down low to the mixed phase region, you still have supercooled drops. You're going to get the trace gases to go into the cloud drops even more. I also want to introduce another term, and that's effective Henry's law coefficient. And that's because we don't have just the physical partitioning between gas and aqueous phase and you're done, but a number of these trace gases either hydrolyze, like formaldehyde, or dissociate, like acids do. And so really, there's an effective Henry's law where you need to consider the whole family of that particular species. In general, the effective Henry's law coefficient is greater than that physical solubility. Okay, so those are trace gases. On aerosols, I'm going to focus on sulfate aerosols, ammonium, nitrate, and organic aerosols. We know that sulfate, ammonium, and nitrate have a high hygroscopicity, so we're going to expect that they're going to get scavenged by these storms. On the other hand, organic aerosols have a lower hygroscopicity, and so we're maybe not quite as sure as how much will get scavenged by the storms. The key processes for the aerosols are cloud drop activation, ice nucleation, and impaction scavenging. Okay, so that's a little background on those solubilities. Let's imagine you're one of those trace gases in the air parcel that's getting ingested into a storm. You enter the storm, cloud water shows up, the trace gas dissolves into the cloud drops, and can even move on into rain as the cloud drops grow into the raindrop sizes. If that parcel makes it up into the mixed phase region, then you're starting to deal with supercooled cloud drops, which then can be collected by precipitation ice like snow. Rime snow will make graupel. The graupel will collect the cloud drops, and graupel will form hail, which also will collect cloud drops. And so any of these snow, graupel, hail collecting cloud drops means that those cloud drops are freezing onto those particles. For this work, we're going to assume that the focus on a mixed phase region really just stuck between 0 degrees and minus 15 degrees, focusing on that area and trying to understand how the ice physics affects the trace gas scavenging. Okay, so there's some background material, and already ready to get to the results. So, no, not quite ready to the results. I'm going to tell you how we get to those results. So next is the approach of analyzing the observations. Okay, so I mentioned the DC3 and Seekers field campaigns. DC3 took place in 2012. It sampled deep convection in the central US from Colorado to Oklahoma to Alabama. And the Seekers field campaign took place the next year. And it sampled some storms. Generally, they were a little bit weaker than we encountered in DC3. And those storms were primarily in the southern US. Our sampling strategy is shown by this schematic, and which looks a little bit complicated, but I just want to point out a few things from it. We make use of weather balloons, the radiosondes, to characterize the thermodynamic environment of the storm. We make use of ground-based radars to characterize the storm structure and kinematics. And then we also use the lightning mapping arrays to tell us how much lightning activity is going on in these storms. And then we make thorough use of aircraft to understand the composition of the air going into the storm and coming out of the storm. So we had sampling in the boundary layer, and I guess this is maybe working. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so we had sampling going on the boundary layer, sampling going on in the outflow regions, and then we had vertical profiles in the clear air near the storms. So that all that information is used in this analysis. To get scavenging efficiencies, which is really just 1 minus the transport efficiency, we went through these 3 steps. So we start with a passive insoluble trace gas, like carbon monoxide, to help us determine what the entrainment rate is of the storm. And so it uses this equation here in the number 1, where we know that insoluble passive trace gas will only be affected by the transport and entrainment processes. And so we iterate through the process to calculate a storm top concentration that matches what we measured. We then have the entrainment rate, and then we can use that entrainment rate to do the exact same calculation for a soluble trace gas or an aerosol. And that's the second equation there. And then we simply take the calculated concentration of the soluble trace gas at the top of the storm and compare it to what we measured and use that difference to give us a scavenging efficiency. Some people have asked in the past, how do we know that our inflow is connected to what we measured in the outflow? And we check on that by using chemical tracers. So I can use this as a little plug that, hey, chemical tracers are a great way to understand the transport going on. We use the ratios of iso to normal butane and iso to normal pentane in this case to show that the air is connected between the inflow and outflow regions. Okay, so there are a lot of measurements that go into this, and I really want to highlight and thank these people for taking these really good measurements. So listed here are a number of passive insoluble trace gases that we made use of. From the whole air sampler, carbon monoxide from the ACOM instrument, carbon dioxide, were all used to help understand this entrainment rate. And then we looked at these soluble trace gases. I mentioned the peroxides and formaldehyde. We've also have looked at nitric acid and SO2. And then aerosol mass concentrations are coming from the aerosol mass spectrometer. That's measuring the concentrations of these aerosols for sizes 1 micron and smaller. Last, we do need to use other measurements. We make use of the nitric oxides measurements, as well as ice water content and pressure, temperature, and winds from the aircraft. I commented about the radiosondes and radar data earlier as well. So all key parts to doing this analysis. Okay, so now I'm ready to show some results. And so I'm going to start by mentioning what we looked at. We analyzed 7 convective storms in DC3 and 2 convective cases in Seekers. So in DC3, you can see on the bottom left that we sampled 4 storms in Colorado and southwest Nebraska, 2 storms in Oklahoma, and we did a little bit of analysis of a storm in northern Alabama. In Seekers, there were 2 cases. There were 2 storms sampled in Mississippi, and then a storm in the Gulf of Mexico and in Texas, southern Texas. So these storms ranged in severity from air mass type storms to multicells to supercells. And so I'm going to use the severe weather threat index to differentiate among these storms. It's really only being used for that purpose and to give us an idea if scavenging differs from among different types of storms. The severe weather threat index combines low-level moisture, instability, wind speeds, and warm air advection value, using values at the 850 and 500 hectopascal levels. And just to give you an idea, a sweat index of greater than 300 is potential for severe storms, greater than 400 is a potential for tornadoes. The picture of the storm that you see on the bottom left had a sweat index above 400. It did indeed produce large hail, and later, after our sampling, produced a tornado. So we did find a range of storms that we sampled. Okay, so I'm going to just jump to the answers for scavenging efficiencies. And shown on the left are 3 panels. I'm showing scavenging efficiency on the left as a function of this severe weather threat index on the x-axis. At the top is hydrogen peroxide scavenging efficiencies. In the middle, formaldehyde scavenging efficiencies, moderately soluble. And then on the bottom is methyl hydrogen peroxide. And so what I want to point out is that the hydrogen peroxide scavenging efficiencies are greater than 80%, no matter what the severity of the storm. And then doing some further analysis, especially with some more chem simulations, we could really see that because of its high solubility, it got scavenged in the warm region of the storm. And so it really just moved on from cloud water to rain and getting scavenged that way. Formaldehyde scavenging efficiencies are more about 50% in range. I think if you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see a slight decrease of scavenging efficiencies as the severity of the storm increases. I'm not sure how much to put into that. But we did find some effects on formaldehyde with ice physics, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation. And then there's methyl hydrogen peroxide. It's a mildly soluble trace gas, and we found scavenging efficiencies that were all over the place. We've have looked at a number of possible reasons why this is happening. You can see it's not the severity of the storm. We did learn that there is this possible interference to the methyl hydrogen peroxide measurements coming from methane glycol. After that was characterized a couple years ago, I went back and looked at how that interference might affect these scavenging efficiency calculations, and it does not affect this answer that methyl hydrogen peroxide is getting scavenged more than we expected. What we expect is what's in that little pink box in the bottom right, where it's only a tiny fraction. So I don't have an answer as to what's causing higher scavenging efficiencies for methyl hydrogen peroxide or not, and I'm sure that'll be just something that I continue to try to figure out over in the upcoming years. Okay. So that showed over a range of types of storms, but I also wanted to highlight looking at this one case study where we sampled a storm over the Gulf of Mexico and then sampled a storm that was south of San Antonio. And so that gives a nice comparison of marine convection versus land convection. And the reason that we thought this would be interesting is because we know these different types of convection have different characteristics. Usually there's more CCN in land convection compared to marine convection, higher sensible to latent heat ratios for land convection, higher in cooler cloud bases, lower relative humidity, greater vertical velocities in land convection compared to marine convection, and possibly more ice phase processes affecting precipitation formation in the land convection. So for these 2 cases, we looked at some of the data and saw that indeed there are some of these differences. CCN was higher in the land convection compared to the marine convection. We did find a higher cloud base and higher vertical velocities. So there is definitely differences here. I do want to comment that this might be more quasi-marine convection rather than purely remote marine convection. Okay, so how does the scavenging efficiencies differ in the storm that you see over the Gulf versus the storm over land? I'm going to show, again, 3 panels. Upper left is the hydrogen peroxide scavenging efficiency. And then in the upper right is the formaldehyde. And the lower left is the methyl hydrogen peroxide. And what we learn is that at the upper altitudes, that the scavenging efficiencies for hydrogen peroxide and formaldehyde did not differ between these different storms. There's a little bit of difference in the methyl hydrogen peroxide for the upper levels, but again, because of uncertainties with that methyl hydrogen peroxide scavenging, I'm not going to push it one way or another. We did have a couple of measurements at lower altitude at about 2 kilometers, so we're still in the warm region of the storm, just liquid water at that time. And we find, especially again for hydrogen peroxide and formaldehyde, that the scavenging efficiencies calculated by that method I just showed you were in agreement with Henry's law estimations. So that's actually comforting to know that we're not doing something wrong here. On the other hand, if you look at the low altitude intercepts for methyl hydrogen peroxide, you can see that our observational analysis comes up with the scavenging much higher than what we would expect from Henry's law. Again, I'm not sure what's going on. I've looked a little bit at aqueous chemistry, but I do not have a surefire answer as to why methyl hydrogen peroxide is being scavenged more than expected. Okay, so those were some of the results for comparing among different types of convection. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of the ice physics on the transport of soluble trace gases. And so I'm going to go back to this little schematic to remind you that when trace gases the air particles are lofted above the freezing level, we're into this mixed phase region where we have supercooled cloud drops getting collected by snow or grapple and freezing. And so when we do this analysis, I'm going to actually move to starting to use cloud scale modeling to understand how the ice physics might be affecting the scavenging of the trace gas. And so this brings in MorphChem. We're running it at a cloud resolving scale, about 1 kilometer, 1.35 kilometers in the case that I'm showing here. I do want to mention that we're using the Morrison double moment cloud physics scheme to do this analysis, and that we're doing chemistry with the Mozart gas chemistry and go-kart aerosol scheme, but we're focusing on the trace gas chemistry in this case. So what we do with WRF-Chem is that we run WRF and try to get convection that happened that day. And so here's an example. NextRad observations on the left, showing a scatter of storms. This is probably one of the air mass storms that we sampled. And we made use of the NextRad observations to look at both the horizontal and vertical extents of the storm. And then we looked at our WRF-Chem results and did the same sort of analysis of picking out a storm that has the same characteristics as what we saw in the observations. We checked some cloud physics characteristics as well to ensure that we had a storm that was pretty representative. And then we also compared our clear air vertical profiles from the WRF-Chem simulation with the aircraft observations to make sure they're doing matching observations fairly well. Okay, so looking at this particular storm, we can actually dig into WRF and ask, check in the mixed phase region, where is that precipitation being formed? And you can see about a third of it is being formed by rain collecting cloud water in this, again, 0 to minus 15 degree region. And then about half of it is cloud water being collected by grapple and snow. And again, this is what the Morrison double moment scheme is doing. Okay, so as I mentioned, those cloud drops freeze when they get collected by grapple or snow. So when that cloud drop freezes, what happens to the trace gas? Does it get captured into that frozen drop? Does it get back into the gas phase? Or does maybe part of it stay in the frozen particles? There's actually been some work on this, looking at using a wind tunnel to try to understand what this retention of a trace gas is in a cloud drop. What they did is that they levitated cloud drops, they let snow fall through it, they were looking at dry growth rhyming. And what they found is this neat little curve, basically saying that as you go from low solubility to high solubility, that the retention factor increases, with a couple of exceptions. Two of those noted there, ammonia and formaldehyde. And with formaldehyde, they hypothesized that because it hydrolyzes, it's not getting back to the gas phase as quickly as its solubility might suggest. Okay, so we thought we'd look at this with our storm analysis and with WRF-Chem simulations. And so the way we did this is that we simulated 7 storms from 5 different cases with WRF-Chem running at this cloud resolving scale. One of those simulations is running the storm case without wet deposition. And then we did a few other simulations with wet deposition, but with different retention factors. And so then we could compare 2 different concentrations in the outflow regions, one from the no scavenging simulation and one from when you have a scavenging occurring. And you use basically that same type of equation to get the scavenging efficiency. We then take the modeled scavenging efficiency and compare it to what we got from the observations to help us understand what the retention factor is when cloud drops freeze onto ice particles. So here's an example of our results for formaldehyde. This is showing formaldehyde scavenging efficiency on the y-axis, ice retention factor on the x-axis. The black dots are showing the results from our observational analysis. And so you can see that's coming out to be about 40–50%. The average for the observational analysis is the red triangle. And then the green markers are the results from our 4 WRF-Chem simulations, where we use different retention factors for each of those simulations. And so for this case, the average scavenging efficiency showed a retention factor of about 0.6 for formaldehyde, but there was a range from 0.5 to 0.8 based on these standard deviations that came up. Okay, so that's one of our 7 cases. If we plot all the 7 cases on a plot of formaldehyde retention efficiency, our factor on the y-axis versus that sweat index, we can see how the retention factor varies among the different storm types. And here's a case where we really do think we see a difference among the different types of storms. Higher retention factors in less severe storms compared to the supercell type storms that we saw in a couple cases in DC3. And we don't have exact proof on this, but we are hypothesizing that because of the stronger storms and vigorous storms, the higher turbulence, more ice shattering occurring in these severe storms, that perhaps that's a process where formaldehyde is being released back to the gas phase and then transported up to the upper troposphere. So we're recommending that we need to kind of figure out if this is really the case, but not only is that a possibility, maybe we're just not doing a very good modeling job. Some of these cases definitely need to have finer grid resolution to better understand them. Okay, so that's some of the results for the trace gases scavenging, and I wanted to now move on to aerosol scavenging. Again, I'm going to jump right in by showing you the results of scavenging efficiency as a function of severe weather threat index. The top panel is sulfate scavenging efficiencies, while ammonium and nitrate aerosols are shown in the middle plot, and organic aerosols are shown in the bottom plot. And what we can learn from looking at these results is that we're seeing consistently high scavenging efficiencies for sulfate and ammonium across almost every storm. Organic aerosols have high scavenging efficiencies in what appears to be maybe more of the severe storms, and then maybe a little bit lower scavenging efficiencies in the weaker storms. The surprise of this group is aerosol nitrate. And one of the things you might notice is that there are actually fewer points I'm showing for the scavenging efficiency of aerosol nitrate compared to the other compounds. And that's because there were a number of cases where the concentration of aerosol nitrate in the outflow was actually higher than what it was in the boundary layer. So what causes that to happen? And here are a couple of ideas, right? One is lightning production of NO, followed by oxidation to form nitric acid, which can then partition onto existing aerosols. Another is that we looked again at our clear air vertical profiles, and we noticed that aerosol nitrate had an elevated aerosol layer. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So here are just 4 cases that I thought I'd show. On the left are on 18th of May 2012, 6th of June 2012. These are 2 cases from DC3 that were storms in northeast Colorado. On the right are 2 storms from Oklahoma. And you can see sulfate in red, ammonium in gold, and aerosol nitrate scaled by a factor of 5 in blue. And that sulfate and ammonium have the same shape of vertical profile, and aerosol nitrate has something quite different, a mid-tropospheric elevated aerosol layer. And as I tried to point out, is that this aerosol elevated layer seemed to be occurring in Colorado rather than in Oklahoma. So I wanted to show a few other things. So I'm going to use this May 18th case as an example of what we're learning. That radar reflectivity is shown on the bottom right. It's a moderate convection, but it did have a lot of lightning with it. Pedro, who's working with me with the AMS data, he applied a marker method to try to get more information out of the AMS data. And so what we've learned, if you look at the right panel, is that that was total particulate nitrate that I showed you before. This elevated aerosol layer is composed of just inorganic particulate nitrate, and does not have organic particulate nitrates. So we do expect a high hygroscopicity for these aerosols. He used the EAIM thermodynamic model to get ammonia concentrations. So we don't have measurements of ammonia. So we use this thermodynamic model to see how ammonia, which is the gas counterpart of ammonium, to understand its vertical profile. That's shown in the middle panel. You can see ammonia quickly drops off with the altitude. Also note that we have fairly high mixing ratios of ammonia in the boundary layer, 6.8 parts per billion, which is maybe no surprise considering it's southwest Nebraska and an agricultural region. And then I also show sulfate and SO2. I think maybe also want to point out that sulfate and ammonium have this very small peak of this elevated aerosol layer as well. Okay, also looked at a few other trace gases to see if there are any more clues as to what the source of this elevated layer is. We found higher concentrations of carbon dioxide and OH and peroxynitrates, which is shown in the purple on the middle panel, and maybe slightly higher concentrations of ethane and isoprene, but it's not super convincing. Definitely did not see any increase in HCN, which is a nice biomass burning marker. So I think we can rule out biomass burning. And so based on this, I actually don't have many more clues as about any particular source to this elevated layer. So we went to back trajectories. And so the student working with me, Miguel Hilario, ran high split using the NAM reanalysis to do 2-day back trajectories. And what we found in at least 3 of our 4 cases is that these trajectories were down near the surface, at least in the boundary layer, in either southwest Arizona, southern Arizona, or even northern Mexico. And so what it actually looks like as you look at these trajectories is that you have air down low, and it gets moved to the northeast, and it gets lofted up over the mountains and then put into this mid-tropospheric altitude. So, so that's sort of like the back history on there. And I think next steps that I'd like to do with this is go back to our WRF-Chem modeling. And we actually have the ability to launch trajectories in WRF. And I plan to launch trajectories from that southern Arizona region to see what processes are affecting the aerosol nitrate concentrations. In the meantime, I asked the question of, well, what happens if we did not have that elevated aerosol layer of aerosol nitrate? What would our scavenging efficiency be? So what I did is I took that clear air profile that's shown here in blue on the left panel here, and I removed the increased concentrations and created this black curve where aerosol nitrate just decreases with the altitude. And then I went back to that entrainment model that I talked about at the beginning and calculated what the concentration of the aerosol nitrate would be at the top of the storm. And indeed, as you can see in this case, that the aerosol nitrate concentrations are lower without the elevated aerosol layer than with it. And then I took the next step and looked at, well, what's the effect of that on the scavenging efficiency? So for this particular case of May 18th, it affects the scavenging efficiency by about 7%. There's less of an impact in some of these other storms, but there is definitely some impact of that elevated aerosol layer on how much nitrate is getting lofted to the upper troposphere. So the other possibility is the effects of lightning production of NO. And just to remind you, you have lightning production of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide oxidizes, forms NO2, and that NO2 oxidizes to form nitric acid. Nitric acid, especially at these really cold temperatures in the upper troposphere, will like to go onto the aerosol. And so, so that's the idea. And so I kind of went through this back of the envelope calculation using a chemistry box model simulation. So my box model contains gas and aqueous phase chemistry. I'm running it from cloud base to cloud top by changing the thermodynamic environmental conditions as time goes on. I add in a prescribed lightning source of NO from minus 11 degrees to minus 40 degrees. So if you look at the plot on the left, which is nitric oxide, you can see 3 simulations that I ran. The black one is where there's no lightning NOx being added into this model simulation. And the blue and the red one is where I'm adding in this lightning NOx source from minus 11 degrees to minus 40 degrees. And I did it for 2 different updraft strains. And then on the right, I'm showing how nitric acid responds to that. So I'm actually showing the change in nitric acid mixing ratios due to this lightning NOx source. And so as the legend shows, it's the amount of nitric acid from the lightning NOx simulation minus the simulation with no lightning NOx. And if you look at the top of the, sorry, I can't follow this. If you look at the top of this, of the lines, you can see that we gained anywhere from like 50 to 100 parts per trillion of nitric acid. To calibrate you, that's about 0.28 micrograms per standard cubic meter, which is more than enough to create the amount of aerosol nitrate that we observed. So this is, again, just sort of back of the envelope. Does it work? Is it possible? And it sounds like it is. I did this for a case from seekers that I had already run. And this case had not as much NOx as a number of the cases that we saw in DC3. So I definitely am optimistic that lightning NOx is a contributor to the high aerosol nitrate concentrations in the outflow. But I think we can do a better job of quantifying this with some WRF-Chem simulations. Okay, so all that being said, I put up this slide where I'm reminding you of what I just told you, of what we learned about aerosol scavenging. That's all in black. I did want to bring up some work that Miguel Hilario who's doing. I mentioned he's a student whom I'm working with. He's analyzing some storms in the CAMPEX field campaign, which took place in the Philippines. So it's tropical convection. It's convection that's not very deep, maybe more cumulus congestus, but still having rain associated with it. And it's definitely not influenced by lightning. And he's finding these same trends that I show up in black. High scavenging efficiencies for sulfate and ammonium, and lower scavenging efficiency for aerosol nitrate. I do want to put the caveat here. So it seems like everywhere we go, we always have a challenge, and the challenge in the tropics is that nitrate concentrations are really low. So it's harder to work when, do this analysis when you're down near the detection limits of the instrument. Okay, so with that, I want to end this presentation, remind you about my objective of trying to understand what fractions of ozone precursors and aerosol mass reach the upper troposphere. I know I gave you a whole bunch of information with a lot of complex stuff going on. So if anything, these are your points to remember. So we find that especially hydrogen peroxide and formaldehyde, scavenging efficiencies do not differ depending on the type of storm. That's kind of nice to know. That the moderately soluble trace gases are affected by the ice physics via the priming process and cloud drop freezing, and possibly ice shattering. Particular nitrate scavenging generally has a lower scavenging efficiency than sulfate and ammonium, and often had a higher concentration outflow than in the boundary layer. So our next steps is to try to understand these processes a bit more, and so we're going to go back to WRF-Chem and do a much better representation of the aerosol processes by using the mosaic aerosol scheme, and keep, analyze these cloud scale simulations to understand what processes are affecting the scavenging of the aerosols. And then we're going to take that information and towards the regional scale and global scale models to improve our parameterizations of the scavenging. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for your attention.
The presentation's open for questions, comments.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Really cool stuff. And, it's not a huge deal because you didn't actually find much sensitivity to storm severity. But I was wondering if you had looked at, the sweat index would be something that we use when the storms haven't yet happened. And now these storms have happened. And so there's a lot of other ways we could also assess the severity of the storm. At least, like one plot you showed, there was sort of like a middle sweat score that the results looked very similar to a lower one. And it could be actually that the storm wasn't as severe as it had potential to be. Like there's the potential versus what actually occurs.
Right. Very good point. Be happy to talk with you more about some of these other parameters to look at.
Other questions, comments? So as someone who's kind of completely ignorant of this, what are the chemicals that you're most concerned about, like post-industrial revolution, that are in the atmosphere that weren't in the atmosphere from before? Or is that a concern here?
No, certainly it is. And one thing that we've thought about analyzing and haven't done is, for example, some of these storms that we sampled occurred near oil and gas fields. And so butanes and other VOCs related to oil and gas production are now being ingested into the storm. And so looking at their potential really on ozone production further downwind, I think is useful. Unfortunately, have not done that calculation for you, but I think that's an example, and as opposed to being in a place where you have a lot of trees or whatever and natural sources of volatile organic compounds.
What effects does like aerosol, small aerosol have on this, or have you looked at something like that?
You're asking, am I
Yeah.
looking at the effect of the aerosols on the storms?
Yeah.
So we have not done that for these particular storms, and but you may be or may not be aware that there's a ton of literature out there of looking at how aerosols affect deep convection, and there's a wide range of answers. So it could produce more precipitation, it could produce less precipitation, all depending on the characteristics of the environment and the storm itself.
So we have a question on Slido. You showed but didn't comment on the organic aerosol scavenging. It seemed quite variable. Can you explain the enhanced variability for weaker storms?
Actually, no. So
The answer is no.
The answer is no. So the organic, I think there's more work that we can do to understand this. I think these are probably some of the first estimates of organic aerosol scavenging efficiencies. There was a paper by Yang et al. In 2015 with one of the storms, one of these two storms here, and so there's not a lot of information explaining how it might vary from storm to storm. I think the other thing I want to point out is that the triangles are from seekers that occurred over the southeast US, where there's a lot more isoprene, a lot more organic aerosol. It could have different hygroscopicity characteristics. So in trying to understand this, it's maybe not just storm type, but also the chemical environment that the storms occurred in. Check.
So, Mary, as a completely ignorant in chemistry, but expect you would agree with me, someone who knows a lot about cloud physics, I'm curious how some of the model assumptions that models use affect some of the things that you're looking at. For example, having finite supersaturations in clouds, which models typically neglect, or ice physics being really poorly represented or really poorly represented, how those effects affect what you're looking at.
So just to be facetious, but I thought the Morrison double moment scheme was the best one out there. Sorry, don't laugh too much, Hugh. No, these are limitations we have to work in, and we could maybe address that by testing some of the parameters that affect the cloud physics and its precipitation production, see how it affects the trace gas transport and scavenging processes. Do you try out different cloud physics schemes? There are different ways that we should probably move forward and try to understand.
Do they expect any sensitivity to that?
Do we expect sensitivity to that?
I think yes. Going back to my little pie chart, and you can see that dominance of grapple collecting cloud water. I'm not sure I believe that dominance, so if we play around with that tuning, maybe.
Next question here.
Hi, Mary. Excellent presentation on a very complex topic, or topics. I just have a couple comments. One, you talked about the possibility of the shattering of freezing drops. having an effect on some of the chemistry and gaseous components. And that certainly could be the case, but I'm pretty sure that from what I read in the literature, that the fraction of the drops that shatter is very small, like a few percent. So that's a little
Yeah.
hard to see it having a big impact on the gas phase chemistry.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's like I said in the
Sure,
talk that
I
it's
know.
it's a
Well, you're
hypothesis.
trying to
that-
understand. And
yeah,
you wanna
yeah.
look at all examples, but
And I actually welcome any other ideas of why that retention factor will decrease with increased severity of the storm.
the other comment I would make is, early on in your talk, you talked about, looking at the mixed value phase region being 0 to -15. And I couldn't follow through everything you did to see what the impact of that is. But when you're talking about deep convection,
Yeah.
and even air mass thunderstorms, the updrafts are such, and especially in more severe convection, that you're carrying
Yeah.
liquid water up to much colder temperatures than -15. Sometimes in the intense ones is much as -40.
Right.
So
I completely.
again, like I say, I don't know the
So-
impact, but that's a questionable assumption.
So I completely agree. And so the wet scavenging scheme that we work with makes this assumption of 0 to -15. So that's where it came from. One of the graduate students I worked with, Megan Bila, I asked her to check that, and she said she did. She did not say there was any remarkable result. I'd like to go back and check that because I completely agree that you get super cool drops way up there. And some previous work I've did 20 years ago, I looked at some of that, and you might because of the super cool drops at the really cold temperatures, you might degas or lose the trace gas back to the gas phase, but it then immediately went back into the super cold drops. Because you imagine those solubilities are even higher, which I don't think we have lab measurements to confirm that the solubilities are that high at that cold of a temperature. Hugh.
Yeah, great talk. My ears perked up, and I appreciate the comment when you said you wanted to go to higher resolution. And I'm thinking in particular, with your approximately 1 kilometer grid spacing of under-resolving the updrafts, in particular under-resolving the mixing, the idea that the updrafts are probably undilute. Did you look at that issue at all? Because you're relying on sort of an observed estimate of the entrainment rate, and then the model in order to get the scavenging efficiency. But I'm wondering if you could look at a passive tracer in the model to sort of see how it's handling the dilution in order to kind of get that part of it right, the transport part right, and then be able to build off of that with
That's a good idea.
an estimate of the efficiency in scavenging.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I think the other comment I want to make is going to this strategy of how we sampled. So when it came to DC3 with these more severe cases, the outflow measurements were made downwind of the updraft, just for safety reasons of the aircraft. And during the Seekers campaign, they were able to get into the cloud top and get 5-10 seconds of data, which again is a challenging thing to do. So I think on the observation side, it would be nice to try to corroborate what the model's doing. And so I think your comment about using a tracer to look at the dilution and the mixing, and I do have to kind of think back as to how much we looked at the passive tracers, but I don't have an direct answer, but I like what you said.
Okay, this will be the last question.
It's really not a question, so if somebody else has a question, I just have a comment.
This will be the last comment.
Do I get the last word?
Well, the comment is that as you probably know, Hugh and others, we are developing Lagrangian microphysics when using super droplets. I think that approach would be actually quite good for things that you're talking about, looking at individual droplets, how they interact, rather than using parameterization that you average over the population, and there are some non-linearities that may not be included. We can talk
Yeah, we can
after.
talk more about that. I think I definitely have questions about that. And one of the reasons I have questions is because at some point we want to go back to the regional scale and global scale, because that's where a huge community is making use of it, right? The ozone assessments, the climate assessments, right? They make use of these larger scale models where you do have to parameterize. And so making that connection from the details that you're doing to what's in these other models is important.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mary. Please join us for some cookies and coffee.